Hey listeners, this is Peter and welcome back to the History Shorts, your daily, short format, history-themed variety show and weekly conversation series with the leading voices in history today. Today's conversation is brought to you by thecollector.com, the ultimate online destination for anyone passionate about art, history, and culture. Beautifully curated, easy to read, and perfect for history nerds who want reliable, inspiring content without the fluff. Thecollector.com is just waiting to be discovered. Today is one of those episodes that will stick with you long after it ends. Imagine discovering, decades later, that your own grandparents were Nazi spies, operating right in Hawaii, passing secrets to the Japanese that helped pave the way for the attack on Pearl Harbor. That's exactly what happened to today's guest, Christine Kuehn. In her gripping new book, Family of Spies, a World War II story of Nazi espionage, betrayal, and the secret history behind Pearl Harbor, Christine uncovers a never-before-told family secret that began in Hitler's Berlin, which led to a covert life overlooking Pearl Harbor, and ended with her grandfather becoming the only person ever tried and convicted in connection with the December 7th attack. It's part family memoir, part espionage thriller, and it challenges what we thought we knew about that fateful day. We are joined today by Christine and her husband Mark, who went on this 30-year-long journey with her to uncover her heritage, and also helped with a lot of the research. A quick word from our sponsors. Christine and Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us. We're excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much.
So in 1994, a letter from a screenwriter shattered your view of your family history. What was that first moment like when you realized that your grandparents might be Nazi-linked spies connected to Pearl Harbor? And how did that shock evolve into over 30 years that you spent researching this book?
If you're okay, I want to take you back to 1987. So that was, my dad never spoke much about his family growing up. I mean, I knew he had an aunt in New York City. His parents had passed, but I didn't know much about his childhood. And so in 1987, when he called and said, "Hey, my sister wants to meet you," I was like so excited. She had recently moved to South Carolina. I was in Columbia, and she had moved to Charleston with her husband. And so I invited Mark. We were dating at the time, and we drove to Charleston. And she was just this nice little old lady. Brought us in. You know, we were having this great conversation. At the beginning, I was really nervous, but about, halfway through, I was really comfortable. She was asking about what I wanted to do with my life. And I looked over, and on the end table next to the chair she was sitting in was a wedding picture. And I looked at it, I'm like, "Are those my grandparents?" She just nodded. And I said, "Well, can you tell me anything about them? You know, my dad never speaks of them." And, she didn't respond, just kind of shook her head no. And I was like, "Really, anything, like, how did they meet? Where did they meet? When did they get?" And she cut me off and she said, "You have a good life. Don't ruin it with the past. Don't ask me any more questions about your grandparents, the past, or Pearl Harbor." And I was like, "Pearl Harbor?" We were both a little shocked. We had no idea.
Well, and remember, she said it. She's this little old lady, but she still had a very thick German accent, and so it was really intimidating. She's pointing at Christy in this thick German accent, saying like, "Don't ask any more questions."
Yeah, when you wrote in a book, you guys were like, you were kind of like shaking afterwards. You're like, what just happened?
Well, and I called my dad, and I'm like, "Dad, what's up with Ruth and Pearl Harbor?" She was really, it's kind of upsetting. And she goes, "You know what? That was a really tragic time. She was on the island during the bombing, and she just doesn't really like to talk about it." Well, okay, that makes sense. That's the silent generation. I'm good with that. Fast forward, 1994, Mark and I got married. We have two little kids, two boys, both in diapers. And I received this letter from California, and it was from the screenwriter asking about my grandfather's involvement with the Nazi Party, spying in Hawaii. And I was totally, totally shocked. I mean, I had no clue what was going on. But in, 1994, you couldn't go, "Hey Siri," or Google it. So Mark and I went to the local bookstore. We looked through all these books, and we found my grandfather. And, So we found stories about how he led the attack on Pearl Harbor, with my Aunt Ruth, and I was just devastated. I was embarrassed. I was carried a lot of shame. And, I came home and I went to the Mormon temple, did some research there because they had a lot of genealogy, really strong library. And so, found that the connection was real. It was not, just some family. So I called my dad and I said, "Hey, Dad, I got this letter. Can you tell me about it?" And he immediately said, "Oh, that's not my grandfather. That's not my father. That's not your grandfather. No way." And now I know he's lying at this point. I know he's not telling me the truth. So I hang up. A few minutes later, he calls me back. He's sobbing and he tells me the whole story. And that was really what kicked off this 30-year journey to try and uncover my family's hidden past.
Yeah, and this was traumatizing. It wasn't like you're like, "Oh, this is going to be a great book. Let's get on that." Like, no,
Right.
this was like a family deep, traumatizing experience. What prompted you to finally say, "You know what? I need to tell this story."
I guess if you fast forward to 2020, I'm doing a lot of fast forwarding here,
It's okay. Yeah.
but I received a letter from my dad's first cousin in Germany. She was 86, and she said, "If you want to know about your grandfather, now's the time to ask." And so I started finding out more and learned a lot about the family before they moved to Hawaii. She was basically said the family just vanished. They disappeared. No one knew what happened. And again, about, I don't know, 4 months later, another historian, Stephen Harding, actually had reached out to me on LinkedIn and he was doing research for a book he was writing. And, I was during, COVID was going on. And I remember looking at Mark and saying, if anyone is going to tell my family's story, it has to be me. And you have to help me. And so we decided to take on the project. And that's what really prompted a book. I mean, honestly, writing a book was never part of my plan at all.
So how'd you guys divide the research aspect and the writing aspect between the two of you?
It was so, I mean, we talked a little bit ago about wormholes and, you start the story. So when we first started writing it, I kind of took the lead and initially said, I'll gather as much as I can. And we researched together, but Chrissy'd find stuff and I'd put it in. And so we wrote kind of a march to the truth. And really, when we started this, it was her grandfather was the only person ever tried and convicted for the bombing of Pearl Harbor. That was the nugget. They were like, holy crap, that's amazing. And then we start finding all these, oh my God moments. Oh my God, they're part of the Nazi party. Oh my God, he actually interviewed for the role of head of the Gestapo. Oh my God, Aunt Ruth is a spy too. So it's all these sort of moments that we discovered and we said, well, now we need to make sure, stuff's true, things that have been written in the past are actually things that actually happened. So it was complicated. So we got it all down, and then we started bringing things into it. The rise of the Nazi Party and how this family got caught up, and it was just a chapter. Chrissy and I looked at each other and said, "Well, it happened during the rise of the Nazis. Probably let's give some background on it." So it was just a chapter, and then Chrissy kind of looked at it and said, we should really just weave this in and show how the family got swept up with millions of other families. And, how did this happen? You just scratch your head on how did the Nazis rise to power? So that was kind of the impetus behind it. And then there's edits and things like that. And it was a long process.
Well, it was also a really hard process, right? Because for 30 years, I would do a lot of research and find information about the family. And then another historian would reach out. Maybe they had some information I hadn't thought of. And so I would restart it off and research again. But I was finding out a lot of awful things about my family. So it was just really hard. We stopped and started this back and forth from 1994 to 2020. Once we hit 2020 and we really started diving in, and I found my cousin Lisa, I found Leopold's grandson Canute. I connected with Hans, my dad's younger brother, connected with his children. They lived in Stuttgart, and it just started rolling. And I felt like it was a really important story to tell. And, weaving, my story and my
coming to terms
and processing it, because it wasn't an easy task. I think it just kind of fell into this great way of writing this story in this book.
So, kind of a segue from that, the story begins in Nazi Germany, right? And your family's prominence in Berlin. And then there's also like this twist with your Aunt Ruth, um, half Jewish heritage one, but also involving Joseph Goebbels. How did these origins lead them to Hawaii? Can you maybe give us some background?
Yeah. So my grandfather and the entire family were really part of the Goebbels faction of the Nazi Party, right? So Leopold ended up working for him in the Office of Propaganda. My grandfather was kind of under that faction as well. And so when Ruth ended up meeting Goebbels through Leopold at a party. And so they ended up having an affair, and she was only 19. And at that point, she had this affair going on. But when the Nuremberg laws were coming into effect, banning German Aryans from having relationships with people of Jewish descent, that created a problem because Ruth was half Jewish. What had happened was Friedel had several relationships before she married Otto. One of those relationships produced Leopold, and the second produced Ruth. And Ruth's father was a Jewish architect. And so, the Germans were working with the Japanese during this time period. This was in, around 1934, 35. And when they realized that the Japanese were looking for Caucasians to go to Hawaii, Goebbels tapped Otto on the shoulder and said, "Hey, why don't you go?" And knowing he would take the family and they would take Ruth with them. And so that's how they ended up in Hawaii working for the Japanese in 1935.
Oh, and by the way, they're going to pay you the equivalent of $1.5 million to do spying. So that was a pretty good reason to go too.
Yeah, no, I mean, it seems like they lived a pretty, I want to say, lavish lifestyle in Hawaii in a sense.
Did.
So your grandfather Otto, grandmother, and aunt ran this spy network from their home overlooking Pearl Harbor. What surprised you the most about the day-to-day realities of this espionage, the signals, the risks, and how they blended into this Hawaiian life?
Well, it's funny you bring up that they had this nice house overlooking Pearl Harbor. Some of the early research we did were from books written in the 40s and 50s, really right after it happened, and some of them were just nonsense. They were written very sensationalistically, and a bunch of them said that very thing. It's like, well, they
were on the other side of the island. It wasn't exactly. Yeah, if you look on the map, they were like here, and Pearl Harbor was here. Yeah.
But these books, but to your point, these books, they were taken as real, and they talked about how Chrissy's Aunt Ruth and grandfather Otto led the attack on Pearl Harbor, telling the ships what to bomb, or the planes what to bomb, and where to go from the attic window where they were sending light signals in real time. And so, you read that and you think, well, I guess. But then when you realize the house is on the other side of the island, suddenly that folds like a house of cards. So that was part of the research that was tough, was finding all of the information and then, okay, what's nonsense? Now what's real, and how are they doing it?
How do you vet all that out?
Yeah. So, after you guys did that work, what did this espionage actually look like?
They were brought over initially to be sleeper spies. So Japan was playing the long game, and they knew that if they attacked Pearl Harbor or the bases there, that the Japanese consulate officials would be booted from the island. Probably a lot of Japanese would be caught up in the wash, and they needed Caucasian faces who had been part of the community for years. Nobody's blended in. Nobody's going to blink twice at them. So they'd be able to continue the spying, or certainly the checking into what was going on the island for the Japanese, and should there be another wave of attacks. The FBI had an 800-page file on the family, and through these documents, then J. Edgar Hoover is talking about the family. There's memos to President Roosevelt about the family, and in some of these memos, it states that Otto specifically is going back and forth from the Japanese consulate with a satchel of information. They don't know what was in the satchel of information. They just know that the Japanese were paying them, and that they, were doing things like going around the island, taking pictures of the planes at some of the bases, which isn't illegal. So specifically what he did, as far as other than the signaling system that he got caught for, and and giving the Japanese sort of the ship count at Pearl Harbor days before. We don't know what the other information was or exactly how he was doing it. There was a Japanese spy who was brought over called Takeo Yoshikawa, named Takeo Yoshikawa. He was their super spy, and he was a contact. He and Otto were supposed to be working in tandem. Now, he wrote a book, Yoshikawa, detailing how he did the spying there. And he would rent planes and fly around as a tourist. He would duck into the beach or the water a mile or so from Pearl Harbor and swim to the mouth, breathing through a reed in the water so he wouldn't be detected, to see if there were nets, submarine nets, and how deep the Pearl Harbor was. So we can, I guess, think that Otto was doing some of that, but we don't know. He never stated what he was doing, and it doesn't show up in any of the FBI reports.
Yeah, they did host large parties, right? And
I saw that, yeah, when I was reading it.
Pages, and they would bring people to the parties. A lot of them were naval officers from Pearl Harbor or, Kaneohe, some of the bases around there. So they were definitely working and getting to know the military and keeping track of when, different ships were going to be sent out and sent in. The picture on the cover of the book of the planes were in files that they had found at Otto's house. So, they were definitely passing on basic information in the beginning. We just don't know exactly what.
Yeah. And the Japanese weren't like overly excited about the publicity that these parties were getting.
No, they were not.
We found, Peter, that they sent another spy. His name was Disco Popov. So Disco Popov was a double agent for MI6, and the Germans thought that he was working for them. So he was actually the guy that Ian Fleming based James Bond on.
James Bond, yeah.
So anyways, the Japanese are getting so fed up with the outlandish lifestyle that Otto is leading.
They wanted to switch him out.
That they actually asked Goebbels to send over somebody else. They sent Popov. It didn't work out. I'm not going to go through the whole story with you, but they were frustrated enough to say that, okay, let's do that. But also he was apparently good enough where they didn't replace him with anybody else as they drew near.
Yeah. It's also interesting because Ruth is definitely an asset to this entire operation, but your father, they managed to somehow, hide this from the younger children, so it was like a double life in a sense, right? How they somehow managed to do all the things they were doing, Otto was doing, without really having the children so exposed to it.
Yeah, I mean, my dad was only 9 when he came over in 35. And by 1941, he was 15. But he talks about, the parties. He talks about going to Japan for vacation. So, but he never really knew what his parents and his sister were doing behind the scenes. It was just something they kept the younger boys at arm's length.
Yeah, and you were saying how, when they had to actually talk about this in court, how this must have been an extremely traumatizing experience for these two boys.
Yeah, I can't imagine as a mom. I mean, I have 3 kids of my own, and the one thing you do is you protect your children, right? That is the one job that, we do as parents, is to protect them. And I just have never been able to understand how Friedel and Otto put Hans and my dad in that situation. And so when they were testifying, I'm sure my dad at 15 at that point had some understanding of the consequences of what was happening, but I don't think Hans did it. Not. I think it was just he probably suffered the most out of the entire family. Was Hans.
Wow. So Otto, as you mentioned before, guys, was the only person ever tried and convicted in connection with Pearl Harbor. When did the investigation into the family start, and how did it lead to their capture? You mentioned this FBI beforehand having this file on them. Do you think this is, I guess, a 3-part question? When does this investigation start? How did it lead to their capture? And do you think this was inevitable?
It was interesting. So the FBI didn't even have an office on Oahu until 1939. And that's when Hoover sent a memo saying, hey, we need to dive into this family. They're living a lavish lifestyle, like we've talked about. And so that's when they started putting together I mean, I'm sure there were some files, but that's when the file really, really grew at that point. So they had informants, all three, Friedel, Ruth, and Otto were put on the FBI watch list. And they were basically supposed to be picked up in the event of war. And so I think that they were gathering all this information, and then when December 7th happened, they came and took the family the night.
It's one of those deals where, in retrospect, you think it was all out there. Come on, FBI, just pick them up, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
But I think it was just they didn't quite have the smoking gun that they needed, and really nobody knew when the Japanese were going to attack and all. But certainly the the messaging system that he came up with, you could have put two and two together and figured out, well, there's no more care about ship movements after December 6th in the signaling system that he devised. So probably December 7th.
Wow.
Looking back on it, when you've done the research, hindsight 2020, it was definitely inevitable that they were going to get
Yeah.
captured. I often wonder, one of those questions I would ask if I had that opportunity is, did you not think that you were putting yourself out there, that you were putting your children at risk, you were putting yourself at risk? Did you not realize how public you were really being at this point? Because they should have known.
So, what new evidence or insights from your research add nuance or challenge, perhaps? And you mentioned this as well a little bit, that the original stories came out about this, really exaggerated all of this, back in the 40s. But what did your research uncover about these debates, maybe about how much that family, your family's intelligence, actually really helped Japan succeed at Pearl Harbor?
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's any smoking guns that we uncovered. All this
Yeah.
information is out there, right? But I think we kind of pulled it all together. We've had a lot of reaction to people going like, "Wow, the Germans had a concern about Pearl Harbor or were interested in it," uh, because again, with Dusko Popov, he had uh, a directive to end up there. There was a Japanese uh, um, lieutenant, I believe he was, that came over with a ball of rice paper, and there were directives about Pearl Harbor on it. But the connection was made that the Nazis were definitely involved and interested in it, which is out there. I mean, if you dive deeply enough, again, go down a wormhole, you can find that. But it seemed like that's been the reaction that most people have had from a historic perspective, is like, wow, the Nazis cared about Pearl Harbor. So that's probably the best example.
So I guess my last question, what lessons do you guys hope that readers take away from confronting uncomfortable truths about one's own lineage and history, especially in an era when so many families like yourself are uncovering difficult World War II era
Yeah, I mean, I
pasts?
think I think there are two for me. One is that we really need to make sure that we're either learning about history we never knew, or diving back in and refreshing our memories about history so that we make sure something like this doesn't ever happen again. On a personal note, I've really come to the realization that, I don't know, that we're not defined by our family's actions. And I hope other people understand that too, especially those of past generations, that we're fully responsible for what we want to do, who we want to be, and what imprint we want to leave on this world. And I hope that anyone that is experiencing, something, shameful, or that brings them grief and makes them take a pause, that they understand that is not who they are. They don't have to live the past transgressions, especially those of older generations.
A tough journey. I mean, for Chrissy, I'm kind of arm's length from it all. This is Chrissy's family, and I will say that, she mentioned we stopped and started a bunch of times, but when she saw that picture that her cousin Knut sent of Leopold, the devout Nazi, and it was their wedding picture, and we opened up the computer and popped, there it was, and his bride is in this beautiful dress, and Leopold's there in this Nazi regalia with the swastika on his arm and the dagger hanging from his belt. It was frightening. So when she says, it's not her fault, you're still going to carry some guilt. I think that the final push too was, we've mentioned before, in our neighborhood a few years ago, there were, swastikas thrown onto the lot yards of some of our Jewish neighbors, and carved into desks and things. And, for all these years later, the anti-Semitism is still out there, and it's pretty rampant, and it's actually growing depending on what reports you want to look at. So I think we felt it was important to get this story out there of how it came to be and how ordinary families were swept up in the whole Nazi mania, which in retrospect seemed like a simple no to make. But so hopefully people will take some of the historical part of that away too. And again, like Chrissy said, kind of pay attention to history.